Just so everybody knows, the last few weeks, the organ had been doing weird things, like Betty Lee would start and never knew what sound, if any, would come out. And so at our recent business meeting, we did vote to repair that. If you have an organ at home that you wouldn't mind donating, talk to Aubrey. But that's why we're having piano music, which is fantastic. Y'all are doing a great job on this. Some of you may have heard this story, but it just fits so well. I have to tell it. And I'm at that age when I can be like, sometimes I tell stories over and over. So when we lived in Portsmouth, some of the deacons, here, I'm not an outdoorsman. I don't know if you figured that out about me. Very pale skin. I burn easily. Don't enjoy bugs and things like that. So I'm just not. I don't hate it. I just don't do a lot of that. Well, these guys decided it was time to get Bruce out in the woods. They're like, we're taking you hunting, preacher. And I was like, oh, do I get to buy camouflage and all kinds of stuff? Yeah, sure, if you want. So I got myself a suit and some boots, and they hooked me up with and showed me how to use the rifle and everything. And we go out and, hanging out with the guys in the woods. That's kind of fun. I was into that part. And then this was really cool. So we spotted a deer, and I'm not a real good sneaker either, but, it was kind of standing still, and I didn't know the etiquette of things, so one of the other guys was lining up a shot, and I did the same thing. We fired at the same time, and the deer fell, and, we're looking at each other, wow, what? So we go running over, and they start counting. I never knew there were points in hunting, but apparently you can score points, and one of them says, did you know what that meant? He says, well, preacher, congratulations, you've killed your first deer. And I was like, but Dan and I shot at the same time. How do you know it was my bullet? I mean, there's no way you can figure that out. He said, the bullet that killed this deer went in one ear and out the other. Definitely yours. Every preacher gets that joke, believe me. You guys actually listen to me sometimes, but you know why it's funny. And you don't have to be a preacher to get the gist of that. Some of you have been parents, teachers, coaches, and you've probably felt like some of those words just kind of went in one ear and out the other, probably more often than you'd like to think about. But thinking about the prophets, especially during this phase, we had prophets that God would call them and say, they may listen, they may not, but you got to get out there and give them what for. And in fact, with Jeremiah, we see God saying, they're not going to listen to you, but you're still going to go out and preach for me. That's hard. That's hard. Again, thinking just as parents, we're never sure, even though they may look at us very intently, we never really know how well we're penetrating our kids. But they started knowing that it was just going to fall on deaf ears, and that makes me feel for them. Actually, probably in retrospect, Jeremiah probably looked back and thought, man, if only they had just ignored me. Because they didn't just ignore him, they got mad at him for daring to speak the words of God, and he suffered all kinds of nasty stuff. Persecution is a decent word for it, just because he did what God told him to do. And so we need to talk about this guy a little bit. He had a tough assignment, because the last pieces of what used to be the nation of Israel were starting to fall apart. And God just said, listen, you're going to speak, and they are not going to listen. This is kind of the last phase. And just to catch up real quick. So again, we've been going through the story start to finish. And so we saw God's creation of humankind and the human rejection of the perfection of Eden. And then God's promise to Abraham to build a nation out of him through which he would bless the world. And so this nation had been central to God's plan. And we saw last week how he revealed through Isaiah that the Messiah was going to come one day and bring salvation to all. But this kingdom, the kingdom of Israel that God had raised up they had a few good years, a couple of good kings, and then they just seemed to go into this death spiral almost immediately. And it just goes down and down. Every now and then there'd be a decent king and they would hold steady. And then all too often the very next one would be worse than ever. And the death spiral would continue. And so we get to this point in the story. This is found in 2 Chronicles 36. The Lord, the God of their ancestors, it's a telling phrase, isn't it? Sent word to them through his messengers again and again, because he had pity on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked God's messengers, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord was aroused against his people, and there was no remedy. That was one of the things we focused on during our Sunday school video, was just this idea. There was no remedy. That's not the kind of statement you want to hear basically ever. You don't want your doctor to say that. You don't want the mechanic to say that. You don't want God to say that. There's no remedy. And to clarify, at first I just thought, that doesn't fit with the eternally forgiving God. What about the prodigal son coming back? And how can there really be no remedy? But this is the thing. There was no remedy for the decisions God's people had made. The bill was due. The consequences could be put off but not avoided. In fact, there are some things that kind of jumped out at me where God's saying, did you think I was just making empty threats? No. I mean, and if you haven't done it yourself, you've seen it. You know what happens when a parent says, if you do that again, and then doesn't follow through. Said parent becomes irrelevant in a lot of ways and ignored. And, well, that's not our God, is it? One of the things that makes God someone we can believe in is that he is consistent and doesn't just say things. That would be very difficult for our part. But remedies, and again, this may be a language thing, but in my mind, a remedy is something that kind of takes the problem away. It makes the pain go away. There was no taking this pain away. Nothing could do that because justice had to be done. There had to be consequences for the choices. And see, we've got these people. It is a tragedy. I don't think we always wrap our minds around it just because it's kind of a distant past thing, but the tragedy of these people that God brought up out of nothing, made into a nation, brought out of slavery in a spectacular way, led them, a ragtag bunch who had never held anything but brick-making tools, to incredible military victories over numerous warlike clans, to take over the promised land, raised them up to a power, maybe not a world power like Rome, but certainly in their region they were very prominent for a short time. And this was the group that just became beyond hope. But just because there was no hope for them in this present situation, that did not mean and does not ever mean that God's plan was over. Remember, in the upper story and lower story, God's plan has been consistent throughout, no matter the mess people made in the lower story down here on earth. And so, even though his people were not carrying their part of the deal, God's plan was moving forward. And after a career of being ignored and seeing all sorts of terrible things, Jeremiah got the privilege, I guess. He got to unveil an amazing twist that I don't think anybody ever saw coming. If you were reading this just as a normal novel, there's no way you could predict such a thing, because they had not just decided not to be close with God. They had gone the other direction. I mean, we had kings building places of idol worship. encouraging people. They didn't just ignore God and stay home and watch football on Sundays. They rejected him completely and chased other gods. I mean, we read about a king, that's one thing to go through the motions and say, I'm going to give the people what they want to be happy. He sacrificed his son to one of these idols, trying to get a sign from somebody. Do you see? So this was entirely in the other direction. Not just taking it devotion down to zero, but going way into the negatives. And God says, well, but I'm not giving up on you. How does that even happen? They never got their act together. They didn't turn back and say, oh, we messed up. They blew it start to finish. And while they were still in the midst of blowing it, while they were heading for complete disaster, God says, I'm not giving up on you. I'm going to bring you back. Even though you haven't gotten right with me, even though you haven't repented, I'm telling you, it's all planned out. So the same guy who got to say, hey, the window is closed, no more chance to repent, you guys are done, also got to say, and still, God is planning to bring you back. Up until this moment, up until Jeremiah unveiled this, they were at best thinking, wait a few hundred years on the Messiah to come around. But here they get what I consider much better news. Now, keep in mind, and if you tried to read through this, you might have gotten a little confused. It's even more confusing trying to do it book by book. But the fall of Judah was not like, here's the day when it all happened. It was sort of this multi-stage, complete mess. That's really so. Josiah, you remember that guy? One of my favorites, the boy king. So he comes in after, he was the grandson of Manasseh, the one who burned his own child in the fire for Moloch. He comes in as a boy. They rediscover, this tells you why things were in such disarray, rediscover the scriptures. He leads this great revival, tries to bring Israel back, and things are looking good, and then his son is one of the worst. It's like, how does this happen? Why? So right after that, I mean, really, right after the sort of renaissance of Josiah's time, I mean, like the second he died, the death spiral goes right back. Pretty soon, Israel is a vassal nation, which means they had to pay tribute to Egypt just to keep peace. And then they were vassals to Babylon, had to pay tribute so that they didn't get invaded. And then one of the kings was like, we're not going to do that anymore. Oh, we're not giving you our money. And, I mean, Babylon was a world-dominating power at that point. I don't know. He got some bad advice. So that is when Nebuchadnezzar came in. He didn't destroy everything, but he came in and he took the king. He took all the king's wives, took all of his advisors, took all the artisans and people with skill, took all the fighting men. And left towns and took all of them. That is what is referred to as the exile. Okay? So Judah was technically still there. It was a little bit of a shell of what it had been, but it was still there. It was still a kingdom. And Nebuchadnezzar set up his own little puppet on the throne to kind of keep things going. But that was when Daniel and his compatriots, we'll talk about them next week, but that was the exile when they were taken to Babylon and they tried to convert everybody into good Babylonian citizens. So there were some shenanigans. About 10 years passed, various crazy things. I mean, and then about 587 BC, the last straw was snapped, and Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Jerusalem, completely destroyed the city, and took everybody who could walk on their own. So only the very old and infirm were left at that point. So that was really the end. So here's what's interesting. Part of Jeremiah's prophecy came right in between the exile and that final destruction, and that is when he unveils the plan. This is really incredible. This is Jeremiah 29, if you'd like to look this up. And so Jeremiah is sending this to the elders among the exiles, the ones who had been taken to Babylon. This is not something that was read in Jerusalem. This was sent to the exiles. And so he says, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. To all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon, build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons. Give your daughters in marriage so they too don't. I mean, he's saying, settle in. You're going to be there a while. This is not going to be quick. There's not some amazing fix. Okay? Pray to the Lord for this city into which I carried you into exile, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Don't listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. Because, of course, there are going to be people like, oh, God's going to bring us back any minute now. I just need a bigger offering. That's probably about how it went. This is what the Lord says. This is verse 10. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my gracious promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Ever heard that? Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. You hear that one a lot. It is a wildly popular verse for very obvious reasons. But think of the context of this, okay? It's one thing for us to hear that when we're young and not sure what we're going to do with our lives, or some tragedy hits and we're not sure how things are going to turn out. But this is the end of their nation. Just try to put yourself there. It's a little difficult. Just imagine, we'll just narrow in. Imagine every person who can walk under their own power taken out of Urbanna and not one stone left on top of each other. And then somebody's saying, listen, got plans for you. Hopeful plans. Yeah, it's different. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. Oh, 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 oh. Wow. So, a little bit of the good news and bad news, huh? The good news is God has a plan. The bad news is it's a 70-year plan. And I imagine a few of the people are thinking, is there an accelerated system? Is there a 70-minute plan, maybe? And think, we've talked about this before. We are well aware of God's timing and how it's so different from ours. We know that. But just think of the times when you felt some urgency, when you needed to know, is this the right person? Can this relationship be saved? Can I do this? Can I make this work? God, what should I do? And you're waiting. And the 70-minute plan sounds fantastic at that point. Israel got, the 70-year plan. So the good news, it is good news. God does have a plan. He's not done with you. He should be, by all rights, by everything human logic, he should be wiping his hands off, kicking dust off his sandals, and leaving you. But he has a plan. Even though you didn't get your act together, even though there was no repentance in your hearts, you're still part of the plan. And just like with the 40 years in the desert, none of the adults alive at that time were going to make it through the 70 years. That just wasn't going to happen, right? But we know, because we see it. In 2 weeks, we'll do Ezra. And I'll give you a spoiler. There were people who were there at the rebuilding of the temple who wept because they remembered the original. Maybe they were kids, I don't know. They lasted 70 years in exile. That's pretty good. But they had to have been very young at the start. And maybe sometimes everybody, even church people, maybe we forget God for spells. Probably not for long periods of time. I hope not. But you probably all know somebody, probably love somebody who has forgotten God or kind of gone in another direction, chosen their own path, just like Israel. And I'm sure that there are many of us here who pray constantly for our loved ones who seem like they've rejected God. And I think this is kind of a ray of hope for us. Because even though they forgot him, he didn't forget them. See, and this is a kind of weird phrase, but just listen. How they lived didn't change how they were loved. Everything they did was a rejection of God's way, but that did not change. The way they lived did not change the way they were loved. And we can't push that too far, get carried away with it. You know, we don't want to go home and say, hey, I can do whatever I want because God still loves me. Well, actually, that's true, but I think we've all, I hate to beat dead horses, although it does happen sometimes, but there's always consequences. Choosing something other than God's way and God's wisdom, there's always consequences, and some of them are terrible. And those you don't get to negate. But at the same time, we should never write ourselves off, and we shouldn't write anybody else off because we think they're too far gone or have rejected God too much or are just too disinterested. Because God's own people, they rejected him. They laughed at his prophets, scoffed like, oh my gosh, this is so dumb. At words of warning, ridiculed his prophets, like ran away from God, embraced idols, and God still had plans to bring them back. Something for us to hold on to. And I hope you mentioned, I kind of emphasized it while I was reading, but there were some really important phrases in there. You know, of course he said, I'll fulfill my promise to bring you back. He's not just a vengeful God exacting his punishment. He's allowing to happen what they'd been basically asking for years. He's not working on payback. He's working on the way back to him. He's giving them the experience they need to realize they need him. And we've talked some about that too. Everybody has to get to a point where their own resources are exhausted or they hit their own rock bottom, whatever that is, and realize their need for God. And they had lots of chances. This is what they needed. He's giving them the experiences. And notice he said, then, once this is done, then you're going to call to me and I'll answer. Then you'll be able to get right with me. And notice he said, to all those I carried into exile. Don't make any mistake. This wasn't just some political thing. This wasn't a war thing. This wasn't a battle thing. This is not even about Babylon. This is what I decided was going to happen. And so then he calls Jeremiah, who had the same kind of response as Isaiah, same as Moses. You know, me? You want me to do what? I am not the man for the job. And God just says, I'm putting the words in your mouth. I got this. And his poor guy first has to tell him, this is all over, you're done. But then he gets to say, you're not without hope. God has a plan. He will bring you back. And if you haven't read the book of Lamentations, you know, we do like the happy stories more than the sad ones. And Lamentations is just the kind of book that you're like, do I really have to read that? Because it doesn't sound uplifting. Well, considering what was going on, what else is the guy going to write? So it's traditionally believed that these are Jeremiah's reflections. And he is lamenting what he saw, what he was a part of, what he witnessed, and somewhat his role. But listen, this is Lamentations chapter 3. And this is really incredible. I just want to take a couple minutes and go through this. I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. He has driven me away and made me walk in darkness rather than light. Indeed, he has turned his hand against me again and again, all day long. He has made my skin and my flesh grow old and has broken my bones. He has besieged me and surrounded me with bitterness and hardship. He has made me dwell in darkness like those long dead. He has walled me in so I cannot escape. He has weighed me down with chains. Even when I call out or cry for help, he shuts out my prayers. He has barred my way with blocks of stone. He has made my paths crooked. I'm going to fast forward a little bit. He pierced my heart with arrows from his quiver. I became the laughingstock of all my people. They mock me in song all day. He has filled me with bitter herbs and sated me with gall. He has broken my teeth with gravel, trampled me in the dust. I have been deprived of peace. I have forgotten what prosperity is. So I say, my splendor is gone, and all that I had hoped for from the Lord. See, he's kind of not really just himself, as Israel itself, as Jerusalem. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. For his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. That's a great hymn any Sunday. But when you think about sitting in the rubble, looking at the destruction of everything you ever knew, and saying his mercies are new every morning, great is thy faithfulness, that's a different song right there. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke while he is young. Let him sit alone in silence, for the Lord has laid it on him. Let him bury his face in the dust. There may yet be hope. For men are not cast off by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love. For he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to the children of men. That's not even half of it. It goes on and on. But you see this balance of just sheer destruction, but realizing, at least Jeremiah, I don't know if everybody else got it. I think they did later. That was what they needed to experience. And see, this is one of the reasons it's so hard for people to wrap their minds around God. And you may have talked with people who just found, I can't make sense of it. Is God this God of wrath and judgment from the Old Testament, or is he the God of love and mercy from the New Testament? And the answer is yes. Yes, he is. See, people can't be both. We are either one of those law and order people who we just need things to be right, we need the rules to be followed, we want it all to be by the book, right? And then there are those who are merciful, and they always are driven by the need to extend mercy. In a person, you can't really do both at the same time, but God is both. He is completely just and completely merciful. And we just have to accept that part. This last part from Jeremiah, it's a nice kind of setup for our discussion of communion, but also a good tie-in to later in the story. Jeremiah says, has a nation ever changed its gods? Yet they are not gods at all. But my people have exchanged their glorious God for worthless idols. Be appalled at this, you heavens, and shudder with great horror, declares the Lord. My people have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water. Oh, wow. You know, when I first started reading that, as soon as I saw two sins, I was like, whoa, because I've seen several hundred just this last chapter, right? I mean, but it all boils down to forsaking God, and then, like I was saying, choosing something else to put your water in, choosing another source of sustenance and life and comfort, something that you made out of metal or built out of wood. And we all have a human tendency to want to dig our own cisterns and have something held back. It's hard to trust entirely on what God provides. That's why it was so special when Jesus met the woman by the well many years later. It says, you know, if you get to know the right guy, you never have to do this again, because you'll have the living water. And indeed, it's what Jesus brings us, what he sacrificed his life to bring to us, that allows us to have that lifelong sustenance, that source of strength and energy, source of life, that otherwise we just struggle without it. So I'd like my deacons to come up and join me as we prepare ourselves to celebrate communion. Father, we do thank you for being our source of water. May we never trust in our own cisterns. We know nothing else holds water. We want to trust in Jesus, the source, the spring of living water. May it flow throughout us and spread to all those we meet. We ask this in the name of Christ. Amen. Jesus broke the bread and passed it among them. He said, "This is my body, broken for you. Eat in remembrance." Jesus said, "This is my blood shed for the forgiveness of sins. Drink in remembrance." Well, the good news is in like 3 or 4 more weeks, we'll get to happier stuff. But it stays grim for a few more chapters, to be honest. But God's plan is still moving forward. We're going to stand now and celebrate the wonder of Christian family by singing "Blessed Be the Tie." Grab a hand.